How did Speaker Mike Johnson transform Nancy Pelosi's infamous dismissal into a tactical W3 upon to force Bernie Sanders into a devastating admission about the true cost of the Green New Deal? Nancy Pelosi had been Speaker of the House for 5 weeks. The Green New Deal had been the most discussed policy proposal in progressive circles for the preceding 2 months, and the question every journalist was asking the incoming Speaker was whether she would put the force of her newly reclaimed majority behind it. Her answer had been, "It will be one of several or maybe many suggestions that we receive." And then she had added the phrase that had followed the Green New Deal through 7 years of political history like a second shadow. The Green Dream, or whatever they call it, nobody knows what it is, but they for it, right? Those words had been said by the most powerful Democrat in the country about the most significant progressive KL-mate policy framework introduced in the modern era. They had been said in the same month that Bernie Sanders, the independent senator from Vermont who caucused with the Democrats, and who had spent 40 years arguing that CL-mate CHANG was the existential TH3 act of the generation, had endorsed the Green New Deal resolution and described it as a critical step toward a sustainable future. Sanders had been for it. His party's speaker had called it the Green Dream or whatever, and nobody knows what it is. Sanders and Pelosi had sat across from each other at the leadership table for more than 20 years. They had been on the same side of most legislative battles. They were, in the specific and peculiar way of progressive democratic politics, allies with divergent visions for what the alliance was building toward. And on February 7, 2019, the person who had been Speaker of the House when the Affordable Care Act passed, when Dodd-Frank passed, when the American Rescue Plan passed, had dismissed what Sanders called the defining challenge of our generation as the Green Dream or whatever. 7 years later, on March 20th, 2026, Mike Johnson had those words in the top left corner of his folder. He had placed them there deliberately, the way a lawyer places the most important document in the position where it will be encountered first, because the most important document sets the register for everything that follows. He was going to use them, but not the way they had been used before, which was as a dismissal. He was going to use them as an irony. The Green Dream or whatever was not his phrase. It was the phrase of the person whose party had run the House and Senate and the White House during the period when the Green New Deal's advocates had had every institutional tool available to translate the Resolution S framework in law. And the phrase communicated what the institution had actually thought about the resolution it had been for, right? Johnson had the Heritage Energy Model. He had the specific numbers from the International Energy Agency's analysis of the Inflation Reduction Act's actual emissions impact relative to its documented fiscal cost. He had the Green New Deal's estimated cost ranges from $7 trillion to $93 trillion, depending on the analyst and the assumptions. He had Bernie Sanders' specific, documented public statements about the resolution across the 7 years since it was introduced. And he had the Green Dream or whatever in the top left corner. He set the folder flat. He waited. The House Budget Committee's special session on federal energy and KLA-mate spending, fiscal projections, and economic impact had been on the calendar for 6 weeks, and it had been organized with the specific bipartisan procedural care of a committee that understood it was inviting a nationally prominent figure with a 40-year public record and a passionate, organized national following into a room where the specific numerical implications of that figure's most signature policy positions were going to be examined with the methodical precision that the constitutional responsibility of the budget process required. Bernie Sanders had been invited in his capacity as the senior senator from Vermont and the most prominent congressional advocate for the Green New Deal framework and the KL-mate spending provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. Mike Johnson had been invited in his capacity as Speaker of the House, appearing as a special presenter with the committee chairman's consent. The room was long and worth it, and by 9:00 inches the morning the gallery was at capacity, and the press section was at the density that communicates historical significance. And the overhead lights were the flat, warm, documentary brightness of a room organized for permanent record. And the stenographer was at her machine, and the cameras were at their stations. And the air had the specific quality of rooms where the proceeding is consequential and the people in it have spent their lives preparing for exactly this kind of room. Mike Johnson was 54 years old, and he had been the Speaker of the House since October of 2023, chosen on a day when the chamber had been unable to find a majority for 4 successive nominees and had finally settled on Johnson in the specific, improbable way that institutional crises produce unexpected outcomes. He had been a constitutional lawyer for 20 years before entering Congress, arguing First Amendment and religious liberty cases before courts that required him to say precisely what the text meant and nothing more or less. He had been born in Shreveport, Louisiana, the son of a firefighter who had been critically B-times renned in the line of duty when Johnson was 12 years old, and he had been the first in his family to attend college. And he had spent his congressional career making one specific argument in many different forms, which was that the words of foundational documents mean what they say, and that the people charged with implementing them are accountable to what the text says rather than what they would prefer it to say. He applied that standard to constitutional law and to budget documents and to the specific documented cost projections of energy policy frameworks, whose rhetorical framing he believed was systematically decoupled from their fiscal mathematics. He had the folder. He had the mathematics. He was ready. Bernie Sanders was 84 years old. He had been born on September 8, 1941, in Flatbush, Brooklyn, in a working-class Jewish family of Polish immigrant origin. His father had sold paint. His mother had died when Sanders was 18. He had attended Brooklyn College and then transferred to the University of Chicago, where he had earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science in 1964, and where he had participated in civil rights demonstrations organized by the Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, including sit-ins protesting the university's housing segregation policies. He had moved to Vermont after graduation and had worked as a carpenter and a documentary filmmaker and a writer, and had been elected mayor of Burlington in 1981 by 10 votes, and had served 4 terms, and had been elected to the House of Representatives as an independent in 1990, the only independent member of Congress, and had served 16 years, and had been elected to the Senate in 2006, and had been re-elected 4 times, and was 84 years old, and still running on the platform he had been running on since 1981, which was that the economy was rigged in favor of the wealthy and the corporations and against the working people, and that the political system was the vehicle available to correct the rigging if enough of the people whose interests were being suppressed organized themselves to demand the correction. He had been the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. He was now the ranking member of the Senate Help Committee. He had endorsed the Green New Deal when it was introduced in 2019 and had called it bold and necessary and a critical step. He had helped design the key LMATE spending provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. He had been saying what he was going to say in this room for 43 years, and he did not expect to change what he was going to say because the room had a Republican majority or because the Speaker of the House was a constitutional lawyer from Louisiana. He sat with the specific, weathered, genuine composure of a man who has been saying the same thing since 1981 and who has found that the consistency across 43 years of people telling him he was wrong was the only argument that had eventually produced the outcomes he was trying to produce. In the second row of the gallery, in the center seat, was a woman named Patricia Lundgren. She was 58 years old, a dairy farmer from Addison County in the Champlain Valley of Vermont, the 3rd generation of her family to farm the same land that her grandfather had purchased in 1954 when he moved from Minnesota to Vermont with the specific intention of raising a family in a state that still had the kind of agriculture and the kind of community relationships that the generation before his had grown up in. Her father had taken over the farm in 1977 and had expanded it from 40 cows to 90. She had taken it over in 2009 after her father's health decline and had run it for 17 years, currently maintaining a herd of 86 dairy cows and a small sideline operation in maple syrup that she sold at the Burlington Farmers Market and through a subscription model she had built from a website she had created herself on. Evenings after the milking was done, she was a person who understood, with the specific non-theoretical understanding of someone who had been running a farm's numbers for 17 years, What energy costs meant to a household that simultaneously heated two barns, ran refrigeration systems, operated electric milking equipment, and maintained the residential structures where three family members lived? Vermont's electricity rates were among the highest in the nation, a condition that had multiple causes and that had been deepening over the period during which Sanders had been advocating for energy policies whose projected costs under the Heritage Energy model and several competing analyses included the specific projection that household electricity costs would increase by 12 to 14% under full Green New Deal implementation. She had attended 3 Sanders town halls in Vermont across the preceding decade. She had heard him describe the fossil fuel industry as the enemy of the people and the existential THTR3 to the planet and the source of the economic and environmental injustice that his career had been organized to see zero embat. She had agreed with some of what he said, and she had been skeptical of other parts. And she had, in March of 2023 and again in November of 2024, written letters to Sanders' office in Burlington asking specifically what the modeled impact of his proposed energy transition policies would be on Vermont agricultural operations that used high-volume electricity and that were already operating on margins so thin that the difference between a viable dairy operation and a foreclosure was measured in cents per hundredweight of milk. She had received 2 form letters. She had driven from Addison County to Washington at the invitation of the committee's majority staff. She was wearing the Carhartt vest she wore on the farm when the temperature required insulation but not a full jacket. She had a folder in her lap with 17 years of her farm's electricity costs and a 1-page calculation she had done herself showing what a 12% electricity increase would mean to her annual operating budget. The calculation was not complicated. It was subtraction. Chairman Jody Arrington gavelled the session to order at 1000 and recognized Sanders for his opening statement. Sanders turned toward the microphone with the specific, unhurried directness that was his signature posture in committee rooms. The posture of a man who has organized the same argument in different forms for 43 years and who has no remaining anxiety about the argument because the argument is the argument and has not changed and will not change because the evidence has not changed. He said, Chairman Arrington, Speaker Johnson, members of the committee. He said, I want to begin by stating what I believe are the most important numbers on the table this morning because I believe that the numbers presented clearly and honestly make the case for the direction I have been advocating for better than any rhetorical framing can. He said, the last decade was the hottest decade in recorded human history. He said the International Panel on CHHEH has assessed that the window for limiting global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius is closing rapidly, with some analyses suggesting it may close by 2035 if current emission trajectories are not significantly altered. He said the cost of climate-related disasters in the United States in 2023 alone exceeded $92 billion in insured losses, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He said the fossil fuel industry received in the same year approximately $700 billion in global direct and indirect subsidies, according to the International Monetary Fund. He said, let me say that again. He said $700 billion in global subsidies to the fossil fuel industry in a single year. He said that is the industry that this committee is being asked to protect by D3 funding the clean energy transition. He said the question before this committee is not whether the United States can afford to invest in a clean energy transition. He said the question is whether the United States can afford not to. He said it with the flat, genuine, 4-3-year force of a man who has been making this argument since before most of the people in the room were born, and who believes every word of it, and whose belief has not been shaken by the number of times the argument has been challenged or the number of elections he has run. He said, the Inflation Reduction Act's clean energy provisions, which I helped design and which I am proud to have advocated for, have produced, according to the Department of Energy, more than $300 billion in private investment in clean energy infrastructure, more than 200,000 manufacturing jobs in solar, wind, and battery storage production, and the first sustained decline in United States carbon emissions since the measurement series began. He said those are the actual outcomes in the actual economy. He said not projections, not models. He said actual jobs, actual investment, actual emissions reduction. He said the budget question I want this committee to engage with is not whether this investment has been costly. He said it has been costly. He said the budget question is whether the cost of the investment is lower or higher than the cost of the alternative, which is the cost of CL. Mate disruption on the American economy over the next 50 years, denominated in flood damage and drought losses and wildfire costs, and heat-related productivity losses and infrastructure replacement. He said, I believe the investment is cheaper. He said, I have the numbers to support that belief. He said, I am ready to defend those numbers. He said it with the full compressed 3-year force of a man who has been ready to defend these numbers since 1981. Johnson said, Senator Sanders, I want to acknowledge something at the outset of this examination that I think will make the proceeding more honest than it would otherwise be. He said it with the specific, organized, patient clarity of a constitutional lawyer beginning a structured presentation in a room where the structure is the argument. He said, I accept that Clomate Chat NG is real. He said, I accept that the economic costs of a warming KL mate are real. He said, I accept that the Inflation Reduction Act has produced some of the investment outcomes you described. He said, what I am going to examine this morning is the specific documented fiscal cost of the specific policy framework you have been most closely associated with, and whether the documented projections of that framework's economic impact on the specific working Americans you have spent your career claiming to represent are consistent with the outcome you say you want to produce for them. He said, and I am going to begin with a phrase that I believe is the most honest description of the policy framework in question that has been produced in the past 7 years. He said, the Green Dream, or whatever they call it. Nobody knows what it is, but they re-for it, right? He said it with the flat, patient, evidentiary quiet with which he said every sentence, whose weight was in the words rather than the delivery. He said, those are not my words. He said, they are the words of Speaker Nancy Pelosi, delivered in February of 2019 when you had just endorsed the Green New Deal, and the Democratic Party's most powerful figure had described it as something nobody knows what it is. Sanders said, Speaker Johnson, I'm familiar with that quote. He said it with the controlled, experienced, genuine irritability of a man who has been in the political arena for 43 years, and who recognizes when a quote is being deployed for effect. He said Nancy Pelosi made that statement before the resolution was formally introduced. He said before she had read the full text. He said she subsequently expressed support for the resolution's goals. He said, the quote you are citing does not represent the Democratic Party's considered position on the Green New Deal. He said, it represents a single off-the-cuff comment made by a leader who was navigating the internal politics of a caucus that included both progressive and moderate members, and who was being careful about how far in front she appeared to be. He said, the substantive merits of the Green New Deal's framework are not determined by whether one political figure was dismissive of it in a Politico interview in February 2019. He said they are determined by the evidence for the policies the framework proposes. He said it with the flat, impatient, genuine force of someone who has been fighting for his ideas for 43 years, and who is not interested in being distracted by the political sociology of Pelosi's comment management. Johnson said, I accept that the quote was an off-the-cuff comment and that it does not represent a settled policy position. He said, I am using it for a specific and different purpose than you may expect. He said, I am using it because I believe it is the most honest, single-sentence description available of the gap between the Green New Deal's rhetorical power and its policy specificity. He said, nobody knows what it is, but they re-for it. He said, Senator Sanders, you endorsed the Green New Deal in 2019. He said, you have described it as bold and necessary. He said, you have used it as the rhetorical frame for the climate spending provisions you championed in the Inflation Reduction Act. He said, and in 7 years, from February 2019 to March 2026, The Green New Deal has not been enacted, marked up, or even brought to a floor vote. He said, "What has been enacted is portions of its conceptual framework embedded in larger legislative vehicles like the IRA." He said, "I want to examine those enacted portions with the specific fiscal precision that this committee's constitutional responsibility requires." He said the Heritage Energy Model, which uses the Energy Information Administration's own modeling tool, projected that the Green New Deal's full implementation would produce a shortfall of 1.4 million jobs by 2040 relative to a baseline scenario, a reduction in GDP of $3.9 trillion, and an increase in annual family income loss of more than $40,000. He said, "I want to note that those projections are contested by other models." He said, "I also want to note what all models, including the models that project net economic benefits, agree on, which is that there is a transition period during which the costs of moving away from existing energy sources arrive before the full benefits of the new energy sources are realized." He said the question is who pays during the transition period and whether the people paying can afford to pay. He said, "Patricia Lundgren is in the second row of this gallery." He said it with the specific, deliberate, constitutional lawyer quiet with which he said every important name. He said, "Patricia farms 86 dairy cows in Addison County, Vermont." He said, "Vermont is your state." He said, "Patricia is your constituent." He said, "Vermont has some of the highest electricity rates in the nation." He said, "Dairy farming is an energy-intensive operation." He said, "In March of 2023 and November of 2024, Patricia wrote to your Burlington office asking what the modeled impact of your proposed energy policies would be on Vermont agricultural operations." He said she received 2 form letters. He said she brought a folder today. He said the folder contains 17 years of her farm's electricity costs and a 1-page calculation showing what a 12% electricity increase would mean to her annual operating budget. He said the math is not complicated. He said it is subtraction. In the second row, Patricia Lundgren sat with the Carhartt vest and the folder and the 17 years of electricity costs and the 1-page calculation. She had been to 3 Bernie Sanders town halls. She had watched him give the speech about fighting for working people and small farmers in the communities that had been left behind by the billionaire class and the fossil fuel industry. She had heard the passion in the speech, and she had recognized it as genuine, and she had agreed with some of what the passion was organized around, and been skeptical of other parts. She had agreed that the billionaires were getting too much. She had been skeptical that the solution to what the billionaires were getting too much of was a policy whose projected energy cost increase would arrive on her electricity bill before the projected green jobs arrived in Vermont's dairy economy. She had not gone to the town halls to argue with him. She had gone because he was her senator and she believed in showing up, and she had raised her hand twice at the second town hall in 2019 and asked him specifically about the agricultural energy cost projections under the clean energy transition. And he had given her a thoughtful, general answer about the importance of protecting agricultural communities during the transition. And she had gone home and written the letter in March of 2023, and she had received the form letter. And she had written again in November of 2024, and she had received another form letter. She was 58 years old, and she had been farming the same land for 17 years, and her family had been farming it for 70. And she was not here to be against the planet. She was here because the planet's protection and her farm's electricity bill were both real and both needed to fit in the same calculation. And the form letters had not engaged with the calculation. She had driven from Addison County to Washington, and she was in the second row, and her name had been said, and the folder was in her lap. And she waited for the senator who had been fighting for working people since before she was born to tell her what he would have told her in the form letter if the form letter had been a direct response. Sanders said, "Patricia, I want to speak to you directly because I believe that is what this committee and this hearing deserve." He said it with the genuine, unhurried, biographical force of a man who was born in a working-class Brooklyn family and who has been fighting for working people since before Patricia Lundgren was born, and who means it, and who the people who disagree with his methods have often acknowledged means it. He said the energy transition is going to have costs. He said I have never said it would not. He said the question is not whether there are costs. He said the question is who bears them and how large they are, and whether the policy is designed specifically enough to protect the people least able to absorb them. He said, what I have fought for consistently, and in every budget and appropriations fight I have engaged in, is to ensure that the costs of the transition fall on the fossil fuel industry and on the wealthiest corporations and individuals in the country, and not on dairy farmers in Addison County. He said the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, the agricultural energy efficiency provisions, the rural electrification modernization funding were specifically designed to reduce the energy cost burden on agricultural operations like yours. He said, I would not claim that we have done enough on that front. He said, I would not claim that Vermont dairy farmers are fully protected from the transition's costs. He said, what I would claim is that the alternative, which is the cost of a heating planet over the next 50 years, is a cost that falls on the most economically vulnerable people first. He said, the farmers who will lose crops to drought. He said, the coastal communities that will lose land to sea level rise. He said, the working families who will pay more for food as agricultural disruption increases. He said, Patricia, the form letters were not what you deserved. He said it with the flat, specific, biographical directness of a man who is saying a hard, true thing in a hearing room. He said, the letters you wrote deserved a specific response about the agricultural provisions in the legislation and their projected impact on Vermont operations. He said, the form letters did not provide that. He said, that is a failure of my office constituent engagement, and I am not going to defend it. He said it with the genuine, weathered, 4-3-year-old force of someone saying something true that costs him something. Johnson said, Senator Sanders, I accept the argument you are making about the distribution of the transition-S costs, and I want to note what it implies. He said, you have acknowledged that the costs are real and that agricultural operations like Patricia Lundgren's are not fully protected from them. He said, I want to add one specific documented fact to that acknowledgement. He said the Heritage model projects that the Green New Deal's full implementation would produce a $40,000 income loss for the average American family by 2040. He said the current median household income in Vermont is approximately $63,000 per year. He said $40,000 on a $63,000 household income is not a transition cost. He said it is an economic C0 lapse. He said, I also want to note something specific about who has been for the Green Dream or whatever for the past 7 years. He said you have been for it. He said the Progressive Caucus has been for it. He said the academic institutions that modeled it have been for it. He said the activists who organized around it have been for it. He said, and the speaker who called it the Green Dream or whatever, who controlled the legislative machinery that could have translated it from a resolution into law, whose party held both chambers and the White House for 2 years, did not put it on the floor calendar. He said, nobody knows what it is, but they for it, is the speaker's description of your signature policy framework. He said, I am not quoting it to be dismissive. He said, I am quoting it to note that the gap between being for the Green Dream or whatever and being able to describe its specific costs for Patricia Lundgren's electricity bill is the gap that this budget committee is constitutionally required to examine. He said it quietly. He set both hands on the folder. He said, the math is not complicated. He said, it is subtraction. The room absorbed this with the specific quality of a room that has been building towards something for an hour and has just heard it arrive in the most precise possible form. The press section was very still. In the second row, Patricia Lundgren sat with the folder in her lap and her hands flat on the Carhartt vest, and the specific nonpartisan professional attention of a dairy farmer who has run the same numbers for 17 years, and who drove from Addison County to Washington because the numbers that are being discussed in budget committees are the numbers her farm lives on, and she wanted to be in the room where they were discussed with the precision her farm requires. Sanders was still, the specific, genuine, hard, weathered stillness of an 4-year-old man who has been fighting for the same principles since 1981 and who has just received a question that accurately describes the gap between his principles and the outcome of the political process he has been engaged in for 43 years, and who has decided to give the honest answer rather than the defensive one. He said, "Speaker Johnson, the Green Dream or whatever is an embarrassing description of the most important clalmate policy framework introduced in modern American history." He said, "I agreed with Pelosi on many things across many years." He said, "I did not agree with how she treated that framework or the people who built it." He said, "What I can tell you is that the framework was real, even when the institutional response to it was dismissive." He said the emissions data was real. He said the economic projections for clay dismate disruption were real. He said the $40,000 income loss that your model projects is contested by at least 5 peer-reviewed analyses that project net economic gains under the clean energy transition. He said, "I am not going to concede that heritage model as the definitive arithmetic of the transition." He said, "What I will concede is that Patricia Lundgren's calculation in that folder is real and is not contested." He said her electricity costs are what they are. He said the form letters were not what she deserved. He said the transition support funding that should have been more specifically directed to agricultural operations like hers was not specific enough. He said both of those things are true, and both require better policy, not the abandonment of the framework. He said it with the specific, compressed, genuine honesty of a man acknowledging the gap between the ambition and the execution without conceding the ambition. The gavel fell. The room held the specific, complicated silence of a proceeding that has arrived at a mutual acknowledgement of two true things that do not resolve each other, which was that the mate framework Sanders had championed was real, and the costs of the transition were real, and Patricia Lundgren's electricity bill was in between those two things, waiting for the policy to be precise enough to address it. In the second row, Patricia Lundgren stood from her seat slowly and walked toward the gallery exit. She had the folder and the Carhartt vest and the 17 years of electricity costs and the one-page calculation and the 2 form letters, and the specific practical understanding that the hearing had produced an acknowledgement and not a policy change, which was more than the form letters had produced and less than what her farm required. She drove home to Addison County. The cows needed the afternoon milking. The calculation was in the record. The acknowledgement was in the record. The transition was ongoing. The electricity bill would arrive in April. The math was not complicated, it was subtraction. She would do the subtraction when the bill arrived, and she would continue farming, and she would keep watching the budget hearings for the year when the policy became specific enough for the subtraction to produce a different answer. She drove. Johnson walked out through the corridor. He had the folder, and the Green Dream or whatever in the top left corner, and the heritage model, and Patricia Lundgren's calculation, and Sanders' acknowledgement about the form letters, and the gap between the framework and the operational precision that farms require. He had been a constitutional lawyer for 20 years, and he had spent those years arguing that the words of foundational documents mean what they say, and that the people interpreting them are accountable to the precision of the text rather than the generosity of their intentions. The same standard applied to budget documents and energy policy frameworks and the specific documented math of transition costs paid by dairy farmers in Addison County. The math was in the record. The acknowledgement was in the record. The Green Dream or whatever was in the record, and it was there not as a dismissal but as a question. What is the policy specifically, and what does it cost specifically? And who pays during the transition period specifically? And is the answer sufficient for the Patricia Lundgrens of Vermont who are running the numbers and waiting for the calculation to come out differently? He called his wife Kelly. She answered on the first ring. He said, "How was it?" She said, "Did he acknowledge the form letters?" He said, "He did." She said, "Was that enough?" He said, "It was more than she had." He said, "Whether it was enough is a different question." She said, "Come home." He said, "Friday flight." He walked. The numbers were in the record. The Green Dream or whatever had returned to the record it had left in February of 2019. It sat now beside the heritage model and the IRA job numbers and the $40,000 projection and Patricia Lundgren's electricity costs and Sanders' acknowledgement, and the specific continuing unresolved arithmetic of a transition whose costs and whose benefits are both real and whose distribution is the policy question that the record requires the institution to answer. The record holds the question. The institution holds the obligation. The math is not complicated. It is subtraction. That is what this morning produced. That is what the budget process is for. Patricia Lundgren walked toward the gallery exit after the gavel with the specific, unhurried practicality of a dairy farmer who knows that the cows need the afternoon milking, and that the calculation in the folder will still be the same calculation when she gets home, and that the record now contains both the calculation and the acknowledgement that the form letters were not what she deserved. The aide from the majority staff said, "He said the form letters were not what you deserved." She said yes. The aide said, "Was that enough?" She thought about this with the methodical patience of a person who has managed a farm's numbers for 17 years. She said, "It is an honest answer." She said, "It is not a policy." She said, "The cows get milked whether there's a policy or not." She said, "I'm going to keep writing the letters." She said, "The next time I write, I'm going to cite the record of this hearing and note that he said the form letters were not what I deserved, and ask what the specific agricultural energy policy is now." She said, "The acknowledgement is the beginning of the next letter." She walked toward the building exit. She drove home to Addison County. Johnson walked out through the corridor. He had the folder and the green dream or whatever in the top left corner, and the heritage model and Patricia Lundgren's calculation and Sanders' acknowledgement about the form letters and the gap between the framework and the operational precision that farms require. He thought about Sanders. He thought about the 43 years of consistency, which was a real thing, and which he did not share, but which he respected in the specific way that people respect consistency when it is genuine. Sanders had been saying the same thing since 1981. The dairy farmers in Vermont who had been told the agricultural energy provisions would protect them had heard the same things. The form letters had arrived instead of the specific policy response. The record now held both the 43 years of advocacy and the two form letters and the gap between them. The math was in the record. The acknowledgement was in the record. The green dream or whatever had returned to the record it had left in February of 2019. It sat now beside the heritage model and the IRA job numbers and the $40,000 projection and Patricia Lundgren's electricity costs and Sanders' acknowledgement. He called his wife Kelly. She answered on the first ring. He said, "How was it?" She said, "Did he acknowledge the form letters?" He said, "He did." She said, "Was that enough?" He said, "It was more than she had." He said, "Whether it was enough is a different question." She said, "Come home." He said, "Friday flight." He walked toward his car. The record holds the question. The institution holds the obligation. The math is not complicated. It is subtraction. That is what this morning produced. That is what the budget process is for. Some policy arguments are genuine on both sides. The cli made is warming and the cost of not acting is real. The transition has costs, and they fall on people like Patricia Lundgren, who run the math on 7-year electricity histories and drive to Washington to put the math in a room where it might be heard. Both of those things are true. The green dream or whatever returned to the record this morning as a question: what is the policy specifically? And what does it cost specifically for the people who are not generating the policy but paying for it? Sanders acknowledged the form letters. Johnson put the subtraction in the record. Patricia Lundgren drove home to Addison County, and the afternoon milking and the calculation that will arrive again in April on the electricity bill. The record holds the argument. The argument continues. The math is not complicated. It waits for the policy to be precise enough to match it. Some arguments last 43 years because they are wrong. Some arguments last 43 years because the conditions that produce them have not changed. Bernie Sanders has been making the same argument about inequality and the same argument about the environment since 1981, and the conditions that produce both arguments are still present in the economy and in the atmosphere. The green dream or whatever was Pelosi's description of the framework in February of 2019. It is now in the record of a House Budget Committee hearing, where it sits beside the specific documented one-page calculation of a dairy farmer from Addison County. and the acknowledgement that the form letters were not what she deserved. The record holds all of it simultaneously, the 43 years and the 2 form letters, and the $700 billion in fossil fuel subsidies, and the 12% electricity projection, and the cows that need the afternoon milking, and a calculation that arrives in April. The record is the accountability. The accountability is the... Sanders drove home to Burlington. Johnson drove back to the Speaker's office. Patricia Lundgren drove back to the farm. The cows needed the milking. The calculation was waiting. The record holds the math. The math is the math. That is what the budget process is for. That is what it has always been for. The record holds the subtraction. The subtraction does not wait. The cows do not wait. The calculation does not wait. The policy must eventually catch up to the math. That is the obligation of the institution. That is what the proceedings this week produced. That is what the record now holds. The green dream or whatever. The math, the acknowledgement, the form letters that were not what she deserved, all of it together in the permanent record of the budget process of the United States House of Representatives, March 20th, 2026. The record endures. The work continues. The math waits. The cows need the milking. That is the accountability. That is what it looks like when it is honest. When the cameras are packed away and the grand rhetoric fades. Who truly pays the price when our most ambitious political promises collide with the unyielding subtraction of daily survival?